The article was published on a Thursday morning. I found it the way most people find things that change their lives, completely by accident, scrolling through my phone before I had properly woken up, coffee going cold on the nightstand beside me. The headline was simple. Precise. The kind of headline that a good editor writes when the story is strong enough to carry itself without decoration. Retired hotelier Victor Ashworth confirms sale of Ashworth Collection to international group for $340 million. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Victor Ashworth was my grandfather. The Ashworth Collection, 6 boutique hotels across 3 countries, each one built from nothing over 40 years of quiet, deliberate work, was something my family had spent years dismissing as a vanity project. A hobby. The thing Grandpa did instead of retiring properly. My uncle called it Dad's Little Hotels. My aunt referred to the guests as people who don't know any better. My father, my grandfather's eldest son, had declined 3 separate invitations to join the board over 15 years, each time with a different reason that meant the same thing. He didn't think it was worth his time. I had visited every one of those hotels. Multiple times. I had sat with my grandfather in the lobbies he had designed himself, in the gardens he had planted himself, listening to him explain what he was building and why. I was the only family member who had. And now every single one of them was trying to get to him before I did. They had wasted 13 years. And what my grandfather had decided to do about that was something none of them had seen coming. My name is Anna. And I grew up in a family where success was measured in things you could see immediately: titles, addresses, cars, the right schools, the right names on the right doors. My grandfather did not fit that measure. Not because he wasn't successful, but because his success was patient and quiet and built in a way that didn't announce itself at dinner parties. My father was a corporate lawyer. My uncle ran a financial consultancy. My aunt married into old money and spent most of her time maintaining the appearance that it had never run out. These were the branches of the family that gathered at Christmas and exchanged compliments about each other's lives while my grandfather sat at the end of the table, asking questions that nobody answered because they were already talking about something more interesting. I was 17 the first time I visited one of his hotels. It was a small property on the coast, 12 rooms, a restaurant that sat 30, a garden that overlooked the sea. My grandfather walked me through it the way a person walks through something they love, slowly, with attention, pointing out the details that most people walked past without noticing. The wood on these floors, he told me, crouching down to touch it, came from a mill that was closing. The owner was going to burn it. I bought it for less than the cost of the fire. He stood up. Everything in this building has a story. That's what people are paying for when they stay here. They don't always know it. But they feel it. I was 17. I thought it was the most interesting thing I had ever heard. My father, in the car on the way home, called it a nice little place and asked if I had done my university application yet. I had. I studied hospitality management. My grandfather was the only family member who thought that was a sensible decision. But I was about to find out how wrong they all were about what he had built, and what he intended to do with it. The dismissal of my grandfather had been going on for as long as I could remember. But it sharpened in the years after my grandmother passed, when my grandfather, newly alone, began spending more time with his hotels and less time attending the family events that had always felt more like performances than gatherings. My uncle said he had retreated into himself. My aunt said he was becoming difficult. My father drove to see him twice a year, once at Christmas, once in summer, and spent most of each visit on his phone. I visited 6 times a year. Sometimes more. Not because I was calculating anything. Not because I was thinking about inheritance or outcomes. But because he was interesting, and because the hotels were interesting, and because sitting with someone who genuinely loves what they have built is one of the rarest experiences available to a person who pays attention. Over 4 years, I worked with him informally, advising on guest experience design, reviewing proposed renovations, sitting in on meetings with his management team when he invited me. He never paid me. I never asked him to. It wasn't that kind of arrangement. My family found out about my involvement through his assistant, who mentioned it accidentally at a family gathering 3 years ago. The reaction was not warm. My uncle pulled me aside at that gathering. "You know he's going to leave you something for doing this," he said. "That's not fair to the rest of us." I looked at him. "I'm not doing it for that," I said. "Of course you are," he said. "Everyone does everything for that." He walked away before I could answer. That was 3 years ago. Since then, my involvement with the hotels had become a source of quiet family resentment. My father began calling more often, not to speak with me, but to ask casual questions about my grandfather's plans, his health, his decisions. My aunt sent messages that always ended with a version of the same question dressed in different clothing. None of them visited the hotels. None of them called my grandfather to ask how he was, simply because they wanted to know. And my grandfather, who was precise and patient and had spent 40 years building something from nothing, noticed everything. The Thursday morning the article published, my phone did not stop. My father called at 8:45. My uncle at 9. My aunt at 9:12. 3 cousins I had not spoken to in 2 years sent messages within the same hour, all of them variations on the same theme. "Have you seen the news? Have you spoken to Grandpa? What do you know?" I didn't answer any of them. I called my grandfather directly. He answered on the second ring, as he always did. "I suppose you've seen the article," he said. "This morning," I said. 340 million. "Give or take," he said, with the specific understated tone of a man who had never been interested in impressing anyone. "Are you all right?" I asked. He paused. "I'm very well, Anna. I've been expecting this conversation. Not from you, from the others. They've been calling since 8 this morning." "I know," I said. "I haven't answered." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need you to come and see me this week. There are some things I want to talk through before the formal process begins. My solicitor will be there." I drove to his home 2 days later. His solicitor, a calm woman named Margaret Chen who had handled his affairs for 16 years, was already seated when I arrived. My grandfather made tea. We sat at the kitchen table in his house, the one he had lived in for 31 years, the one my family called inexplicably modest for a man of his means. Margaret opened a folder. The sale of the Ashworth collection had been structured over 18 months. The proceeds, after tax, after fees, came to approximately £290 million. Of that figure, my grandfather had established a family trust for his children and their families. Each branch would receive a fixed sum, substantial, more than enough, but fixed. Not negotiable. Not expandable. The remainder, the majority of the net proceeds, along with 3 retained properties that had not been included in the sale, had been structured separately. Margaret turned a page. And then she said my name. Anna Ashworth is designated as the primary beneficiary of the Ashworth Private Trust, comprising retained assets currently valued at approximately £160 million, along with the role of trustee over the broader family distributions. I sat very still. £160 million. Plus the responsibility for ensuring every other branch of the family received what my grandfather had decided they deserved. Margaret continued, "Mr. Ashworth has asked me to read a note he prepared." She unfolded a single page. "Anna, you visited because you were interested, not because you were calculating. I have spent 40 years watching the difference between those two things. The hotels taught me that the people who truly belong in a place are the ones who noticed what it was before they knew what it was worth. The trust is yours because I know what you will do with it. You always understood that everything has a story. This is yours now." I pressed my hand flat on the table. The room was completely silent. And outside, my phone, which I had left in my coat pocket, was still ringing, and why grandfather suggested I not respond to the family until the formal documents had been processed and the legal notifications sent. Margaret agreed. I followed their advice. The notifications went out on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, my father was at my door. He stood on my doorstep in a coat that suggested he had dressed quickly and driven fast. Behind him, his car was parked at an angle that suggested the same. Yana, he said. We need to talk about this. Come in, I said. We sat at my kitchen table, the same way I had sat at my grandfather's. I made tea. My father did not touch his. This isn't right, he said. Your grandfather wasn't thinking clearly about the distribution. 160 million to one person, to you, who is not even his child. I'm his grandchild, I said. As are you all. He had no obligation to divide anything equally. We're his children, he said. Direct line. You declined the board 3 times, I said. The last time was 4 years ago. He called you personally. You told him you didn't think the hotels were a viable long-term investment. My father was quiet. He kept that letter, I said. All 3 of them, actually. Margaret has copies. He looked at the table. I'm not saying this to win an argument, I said. I'm saying it because I want you to understand that he didn't make this decision carelessly. He made it over years. Based on what he saw. What everyone showed him. And what did you show him? My father said. The bitterness in it was real and complicated, and I understood it even as it landed. I showed up, I said simply. That's all. I showed up and I was interested, and I listened to him talk about the floors he salvaged and the gardens he planted. I wasn't calculating anything. I just cared about him. My father didn't speak for a long time. When he left, there was no resolution. No apology. No clean ending, but there was something. A crack in the certainty he had walked in with. A recognition, partial, uncomfortable, that something had been lost over the years that couldn't be recovered by a legal challenge or a family meeting. My uncle filed a formal objection 3 weeks later. It was reviewed and dismissed within 2 months. My grandfather had been assessed by a physician 8 months before the sale. The documentation was thorough. Margaret had made sure of that. The formal transfer of the Ashworth Private Trust completed in the spring, became, quietly and without announcement, one of the more significant private trust holders in my country. I say this not as celebration but as context, because the number itself was never the point. And it still isn't. What I did with the first year of the trust was establish a small grant program for independent hospitality businesses, specifically the kind of small, story-filled places that my grandfather had always believed in. Places where the floors have histories and the gardens were planted by hand, named it the Victor Ashworth Foundation. My grandfather cried when I told him. Quietly, in the way he did everything, privately, and without wanting to make a scene of it. Family relationships are complicated now in ways that I don't expect to fully resolve. My father and I speak. It is careful and honest in a way that our relationship had never been before. My uncle does not speak to me. I have made my peace with that. My grandfather is 81 and in good health and still occasionally visits the 3 retained properties, which I now manage, to walk through them the way he always did. Slowly. With attention. Pointing out the details that most people walk past. What I have now, his trust, his foundation, his stories about the floors and the gardens, and the particular understanding that showing up without calculation is its own form of intelligence. No objection, no legal challenge, no bitter phone call can reach that. He built something extraordinary. And he left it to the person who understood what it was. There are people in every family who show up because they are calculating. And there are people who show up because they are genuinely interested, in the person, in the work, in the story behind the thing that everyone else walks past without noticing. My grandfather spent 40 years watching the difference, built hotels full of salvaged floors and hand-planted gardens and stories that guests felt without knowing why. And he left everything that mattered to the one person who had bothered to ask what those stories were. You have ever been the one who showed up simply because you cared? This story was for you. Drop a red heart if you believe that genuine attention is the rarest form of love. Comment below. Has someone ever recognized your presence in a way that surprised you? Tell me. I read every single one. Subscribe, because every week, we tell the stories of women who showed up, paid attention, and discovered that someone had been watching all along, because the people who listen to the stories are the ones who get to keep them.
फ्रेंड्स, कैसी लगी आज की वीडियो? अगर वीडियो अच्छी लगी है तो वीडियो को लाइक करें और एक प्यारा सा कमेंट करें और चैनल को ज़रूर सब्सक्राइब करें ताकि हमारी न्यू आने वाली वीडियो सबसे पहले आप तक पहुंच सके। थैंक्स फॉर वॉचिंग।